hi to everyone tuning in on Zoom, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill live political panel this month. I'm Libby Davies, and I'm joining you from the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples. I'm joined tonight by my regular co-host, Robin Browne.
Hey, everybody. I'm coming to you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples.
Thank you, Robin. Well, tonight, folks, on our Off the Hill political panel, we're deconstructing the labour crisis in Canada, specifically the question, does Canada indeed have a labour shortage? And what does a labour shortage look like in today's world? This evening, we've gathered an expert crew to deconstruct this topic and more. Joining us tonight are NDP Member of Parliament for Hamilton Centre, Matthew Green, economist Jim Stanford, President of the Ontario Federation of Labour, Laura Walton, and researcher and policy analyst at the CCPA, Véronique Sioufi. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to everyone also joining us on Zoom. We certainly encourage you to participate in the chat, and if there are any poll questions, and to ask your questions to our panelists through the Q&A function that we'll leave time for at the end. We'll do our best, as always, to address your questions. So now I'm going to turn it over to Robin to get us started.
Great. Thanks, Libby. All right, Jim, we're going to start with you tonight. So last October, you testified before the Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science, and Technology that was examining the impact of temporary migrant labor programs in Canada on labor markets. And in your opening remarks, you said you wanted to directly and forcefully challenge the assumption that Canada has faced and continues to face a so-called labor shortage. What did you mean by that? And what else did you tell the committee?
Well, if anything, Robin, I was toning down my language to be polite to the senators. I could have used stronger words on that. In fact, I would like to expunge the term labor shortage from the policy dictionary, because the phrase itself embodies a way of looking at work and workers in the labor market that is utterly one-sided. Labor shortage is completely from the perspective of employers. Employers have a task, particularly in the private sector, but in the public sector as well, where they want to hire people, recruit them, retain them, pay them as little as possible, but that get them to stay in their jobs and do their jobs with force and energy and discipline. And in that framework, talking about a labor shortage, I think is inherently accepting and taking the perspective of employers. If we flipped it on its head, labor shortage for employers means full employment for workers. And that doesn't mean we ran out of workers. It doesn't mean that workers, somehow disappeared or stayed home or anything. It means that workers have got some choice and some agency and some flexibility in terms of how they choose to work and where they work and what they can legitimately demand in the way of wages and compensation and benefits and safety and pleasure at work. So I think the whole discourse of labor shortage, which has been going on for years, there's nothing new about this. It clearly got louder in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, you had employers, especially in low-wage industries like retail and hospitality, crying up the yin-yang about the labor shortage, and Canadians don't want to work, and this is why we need to, and then fill in the blank. And there's a whole set of employer-friendly policy prescriptions that are motivated by this false hypothesis of the labor shortage. That includes delay the retirement age. That was Stephen Harper's goal, make people work till 67 to solve the labor shortage. Cut back employment insurance and other income security benefits because they're a disincentive to work and they're allowing people to sit at home and eat popcorn instead of going to work. We need to do that to solve the labor shortage. And then, of course, the whole issue of temporary migration, work permits, temporary foreign workers, and now international students, which are a big part of the international migrant workforce that employers love. They want that, and they say it's needed because of the labor shortage. And in all of those and other ways, this hypothesis of the labor shortage, I think, underpins very regressive policies in most areas of labor policy. In fact, we should celebrate the fact that unemployment is low. It hasn't gone away. In fact, in the last year, since I spoke to the Senate, it's been getting much worse. So there wasn't a labor shortage then, and there definitely isn't a labor shortage now. We're seeing rising unemployment. and say, no, in fact, we want a situation where everyone has a job. Everyone who wants to work can have a job, and a good job. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing.
Okay, well, Jim, that's a great overview, and I'm glad you got to go before the Senate, and hopefully you will again, and to tell them what's what in your forceful language.
Someday I'll tell them what I really think, Libby.
Exactly. So moving on to Laura now, and also sort of looking back a little bit in a September 2022 CBC story about education workers, including educational assistants, discussing possible strike action. There was an Ontario, I think it was an Ontario public school trustee who said there is a labor shortage of education workers. And I think part of the reason is because our school board's pay rate is so much less than the private sector. That was the quote. So Laura, just to you, because you were also quoted in that story, I'm sure you'll remember, was there a shortage of education workers then, and what is the situation now?
Well, I think in the education as a whole, it's a little bit of an anomaly. Even the trustees said themselves, right? You know, it's a labor shortage, but it's because we don't pay enough. It's not a lack of people wanting to work. It's a lack of bosses wanting to respect workers properly for the labor that they are provided. So I think I agree with Jim, and I hope I'm there when he thinks. But I think we do have to turn it on its head. But what we're seeing now in the education sector is that people are not willing to go and get trained into the professions because of the continuous disrespect that we see from governments, that we see from, ministers of education across the country, that we're seeing from the public. And so then this becomes a little bit of a challenge, because now we don't have people going through to be trained, so that we actually don't have people, trained people ready to go into the field. But again, it's also because the wage is so low. The working conditions are so poor. But that's in just education. If you look at the broader, spectrum, there are people that, aren't getting jobs. And that's because bosses have started to figure out, oh, well, I can just put up a, self-serve checkout. Oh, there goes those jobs. No big deal. And these are the things. I'm going to close my earlier, I used to close at midnight. Now I'm going to close at 10, or I'm not going to be opening on Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. So bosses have also figured out a way, claiming labor shortage, that they shouldn't be employing people. But really, let's be clear, they're still making money. They're still profitable. They're still doing well. But, it's really simple to keep blaming it on these workers that either don't want to work, don't have the capacity to work, aren't willing to work. Really what it is workers using their collective power to say, we will not be disrespected as workers. And when we take a job, it's when we're getting to be paid properly, and we're going to work hard for that. And I think that's what we're seeing. It's for summer that we talked about a year ago hasn't gone away. We're heading into the next, year of it. It isn't going away, labor shortage, but what there is an excessive amount of really bad bosses.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really incredible how excessive that narrative is of a labor shortage, and how it just permeates the public discourse through the, the big time media. So I think it's really great that both you and Jim have kind of debunked some of those myths. But just a quick follow up to you, Laura, as we were chatting at the beginning of the show, you were telling us, as the new president of the Ontario Federation of Labour, you're right out there doing a whole lot of stuff, and you're going on a road show. Just quickly tell us about that. It's something new, and it sounds very exciting.
It's really super exciting. I think what we're seeing I hear from my counterparts across the country, there is this real division. It's, us versus them. There are people claiming that they are elites and they're one of us, but really they are part of the elites. And so as a team, we said, let's get out into the communities. Let's get out into the communities and let's build better. So when we're hearing that Canada is broken or Ontario is going, no, it isn't. Not only is it not broken, but we're building better, and we're coming together more, and we're creating the communities that we know are going to thrive. So we're going to be going across the province, bringing in workers from, affiliated unions, non-affiliated unions, underemployed, retired students, community voices. We want to talk to you about what's happening in your community, and then we want to work together to build the capacity to actually make the change. And that's what we're seeing, that workers and community members, they're doing that organically. Let's bring more and more people together so that we can really impact change. frankly, we're at this cusp of something pretty amazing in Ontario and in Canada. And we want to be able to ensure that we're out there listening to the voices and making sure they're amplified and providing them the tools to win.
Yeah, well, that's really excellent that you're doing that, and I'm sure you'll hear from a lot of people. I'll turn it back over to Robin now.
Great, thanks, Libby. Véronique, let's bring you in. In a March 2024 article in the Tyee on closing the wage gap for British Columbia women, the author asked you what some of the biggest challenges BC women face in the workplace or when trying to find work, which begs the question, considering our topic, is there a labor shortage among BC women?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Jim and Laura here. The labor shortage is a myth. It's another way of saying, you know, potentially we're nearing full employment, which we're not. But the impacts of this labor shortage myth, they are particularly felt by women, especially Black, Indigenous, and women of color, and particularly by recent immigrants and temporary migrants. So, you know, women are overrepresented in certain sectors like retail, accommodation, food services, that are notorious for claiming labor shortages and then relying heavily on immigration, especially those temporary programs, to fill those jobs. So we can think like McDonald's and Tim Hortons, for example, are major users of the temporary foreign worker program. And, you know, if they claim a labor shortage and can prove a labor shortage, they can hire up to 30% of their workforce through these temporary foreign worker programs, which essentially incentivizes them to make this claim. You know, their labor market impact assessments are like nearly 100% approved every time, even though it's so-called low-skilled work. You know, and as Jim argued, like the appropriate response we're not seeing, you know, so ideally, if there was a labor shortage in these sectors that women work in predominantly, their wages would go up. It would, you know, in order to attract more women to this workforce, maybe they'd be investing in training women to upskill them. Instead, you know, we're seeing vacancies supposedly increase while wages stagnate or even erode. You know, so we know that this labor shortage myth is essentially like a lobby for these disciplinary policies that Jim outlined, in order to keep wages low in these sectors, particularly service sectors that women work in. So these disciplinary measures, they disproportionately impact women. And like I said, particularly Indigenous women, particularly recent immigrant women. And these are the lowest paid jobs typically. So, you know, if we're thinking fast food, retail, accommodation services, but also in care work and early childhood education. So some of these other sectors where we see a reliance on the temporary migrant program. You know, often the average hourly wage is below the reservation wage, so what people would accept to do the work, and definitely below the living wage necessary. You know, I'm in Metro Vancouver here. The living wage is, as my colleague has calculated, over $25 an hour this year. You know, not what Tim Hortons workers are making. And so, you know, the women that work in these sectors end up more likely to have precarious, unstable jobs, fewer benefits, you know, more likely to have more than one job. And, you know, you layer that on top of the fact that women also tend to shoulder a higher share of unpaid domestic labor. What we're seeing, essentially, what we've done is legislated corporate profits on the backs of Black and Brown women in precarity. So that, you know, lack of value that we place on the work that women do and the persistent gendered and racial divisions in the job market remains significant issues here that these labor shortage myths, they both rely on, but they also aggravate. So, you know, the persistence of the gender wage gap that I talked about in that Tyee article, you know, is particularly because of how we value the work that women do. So it's more about what work women end up doing than those within job wage gaps. And I think these myths really push for policies that keep it that way. And then those consequences, you know, I know we criticize the temporary foreign worker program for a number of reasons. It's not great, but especially because it doesn't treat workers well, right? Like in BC, we've increased the number of net new foreign non-permanent residents has increased by 60% this past year. So non-permanent residents now make up 8%, over 8% of BC's population. And we're not looking at how we're treating these newcomers. Women, especially recent immigrant women, often are more educated than Canadian-born women and especially Canadian-born men, but then face the largest wage gaps, especially like within jobs. So, same job, they make 20% less compared to Canadian-born men. Over 60% of recent immigrants are in non-standard employment. They're more likely to be in poverty. That's 41% for temporary immigrants. More likely to live in unsuitable housing. So there's a big price to pay. Our goal should be both full employment and good jobs. Definitely, we can increase the wages so that it would help to fill labor shortages by making careers in these fields more tenable, but also prevent the migrant worker programs and international students from being used to suppress that wage growth. But probably the most important way we could address some of these major problems with this myth of a labor shortage and the way that it impacts women is through regularization. So permanent status for anyone who comes to work or study or live in Canada. So, service sector work isn't going anywhere. Care work, farm work, these are all permanent labor market needs. And we have to stop this kind of accepted racism of we'll take your labor, but not your person.
Thanks, Veronique. Just bringing you in now, Matt. You're the NDP employment and labor critic. And we often sort of think of employment and labor as a provincial jurisdiction, but there is also a federal sort of oversight and jurisdiction. So just curious to know how this plays out in Parliament, whether the narrative of this labor shortage is what takes over everything, and what kind of issues are you raising as the critic for the NDP as it relates to shortages, employment issues? What sort of surfaces in your mind that you're fighting for in Ottawa?
Well, first of all, I'm so excited to be here with such amazing people, an incredible panel, an incredible platform. The truth is we're up against a juggernaut of a right-wing populism that has an absolute megaphone. So having platforms like this is absolutely critical to gather the thought leaders, the subject matter experts, to be able to dispel this mythology. And it is absolutely a mythology, and it's part of a continuum of far-right lies that do work to punish the working class. It works to pit worker against worker, neighbor against neighbor, in all the pernicious ways in which we've seen play out. And I think, on the conservative side anyways, they take all the worst parts of capitalism and they call it socialism and blame the liberal government. And I think what the liberal government has done, and what liberalism does, quite frankly, in a capitalist economy, is it blames the workers. And you ask, like, why do I say that? Justin Trudeau would never blame the workers. The man literally had a ministry of the middle class and what he called those working hard to join them, as though those that were caught in precarity are, lower income workers aren't actually the hardest workers in this economy. I'm from Hamilton, so I come to my politics honestly through observation, through watching my neighbors struggle, through struggling myself. And look, at the end of the day, when we have a government that brags about job creation, what they're not talking about is they're taking the one traditional job that was enough to pay the bills, to raise a family on, to take care of yourself, to have benefits and pensions, are now divided up into 3 jobs. So they're at the cost of good work. They're creating this narrative, the liberals are, that it's never been so good for people. And I think that's what's really pissing people off, is that disconnect between the sunny ways that the Liberal Party likes to talk about, and then what the Conservatives have done very well is just driven home on the rage. But of course, their economics are full of holes, And I think back to, the way in which they talk about our collective responsibilities on taxation. They'll never talk about greed. They'll never talk about corporate profiteering. They'll never talk about the central planning of Bay Street and the Chambers of Commerce and the Business Council of Canada. The truth is that our economy is centrally planned. And so from a federal perspective, when we're looking at the future of work, I think there is a role to play. I'm going to do something strange as a New Democrat. I'm going to reference a senator. There is currently a senator right now, and I've taken an interest in her work, Senator Diane Bellemare, who is proposing a dual mandate for the Bank of Canada. Because let's be clear, when Tiff Macklin comes out with a class war analysis on interest rates that play yo-yo with it in order to, cool down the labor market and to suppress the surge in unionization and wages, there is a very strong economic theory that says there could be a dual mandate towards full employment. Imagine if we centered workers in this economy at every single decision we make, both with monetary and fiscal policy, but also in the way in which we treat labor. I know, Véronique, in doing some background on the work that you're doing, I believe in my core that we as New Democrats, the only Labour Party in Canada, need to be bold, and we need to proposition central planning by government that would include sectoral bargaining. When I see the retail sector try to unionize, and God, bless them, the people that are taking on Starbucks, the folks that are taking on Lush and all these like boutiques and retail, the franchise model is absolutely a union busting model. And it made unions have to go store by store to try to unionize in order to protect those good jobs. And so, sectoral bargaining is an absolute must. It's a conversation we need to have. It's something that happens around the world. And when you talk about equity, whether it's racial equity or gender equity, regional equity, I think it's something we have to look at. But the last piece I want to talk about, being from Hamilton Center, and the thing that pisses me off most is when they talk about unemployment, what they don't say is they're not even counting people who have counted themselves out of employment. And that's the story in Hamilton Center, whether people are working kind of under the table in really dangerous, precarious situations and just aren't being accounted for. But the truth is it's 6.6% in Hamilton. So anybody who wants to talk about how, there's a job shortage is absolutely ridiculous. And lastly, when it comes to this surplus army of labor that temporary foreign workers kind of are being brought in to do, and again, the service industry, but not just that, even in our big mega projects, even in sectors like oil and gas, which is supposed to be, the bastion of the extractionary capitalist economy, they're still bringing over people simply to replace good working, good, well-paying jobs and to undercut that wage. And to that, I say, in agreement with my colleagues and comrades on the call right now, is that if you're good enough to work here, you're good enough to stay, you're good enough to get a prevailing wage, you're good enough to be protected by all of our employment laws. And I think when we do that and we level the playing field for workers and we center the economy as a cooperative economy focused on the well-being of workers and their families, rather than this ultra-competitive kind of neoliberal winner-takes-all zero-sum game, that's when we start to build the more caring, compassionate vision for the country that I think, the CCF and Labour came together with the NDP to create. So you guys got me fired up, man. It's like a Wednesday night and I'm all fired up here.
Well, that's exactly what we aim to do, Matt, is get you all fired up, get back to Parliament, start hitting it again. I'm actually really glad that you raised the issue, and I think Véronique did as well, the temporary foreign worker program. And again, this myth that ends up pitting temporary foreign workers against Canadian workers, and it's been used so successfully by the right wing. But in terms of the actual numbers, are we seeing an increase in temporary foreign workers? And is there any way of tracking what those wage levels are, like how those wages are being undercut?
Well, I would say this, yep. Like, I only have anecdotal information, so I'll leave it to the economist to come with the numbers. But anecdotally, you only have to travel from Hamilton to Ottawa and do every stop along the way and see where the service economy, see where the transportation economy. You only have to dial in online and see the way in which in the transportation sector, for instance, workers are absolutely being exploited. And the problem with the temporary foreign worker program is that it ties employment to the employer. Now, imagine if we tied it to the sector. Imagine if organized labor played a role where your skills were valued when you came in. You had a fast track to unionization based on your skills that were recognized in a quick, fast track way. And then the unions got to help plan the labor market in a fair way, right? But as it stands now, when you come in and you're precarious, whether you're coming in officially through a temporary foreign program or what we've seen, at least anecdotally, and what's been reported on through the diploma mills that we're seeing in Ontario, in the ways in which these folks are coming in and absolutely being exploited. Many of them, I would imagine, are not even captured in any kind of official capacity, be it through labor laws or through the CRA. But it is a situation that we have to get a grip on, because the exploitation of these people, particularly being pitted against workers, is, to me, is the perfect storm for right-wing populism that leads to deeper levels of white supremacy, deeper levels of xenophobic kind of crackbacks. And like, this is why I've chosen labor and employment in the future of work, because I believe that is the front lines against far-right populism.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And I see others of you were nodding your head. So if anybody else wants to drop in and add a comment about temporary foreign workers and what's going on, feel free to add anything if you've looked at it. Our economists or Laura, anything you want to add? Otherwise, we'll just move on to the next question.
The overall data can be tracked, Libby, through the labor force and population surveys that Statistics Canada carries out. So we can see how many people are coming in under different temporary permit arrangements, both the temporary foreign worker permits and international students. And the overall population growth in Canada last year was over 1 million people in 1 year. That's very rapid population growth, over 3%. And almost all of that was immigration, of course, but 2/3 of it was under the various temporary streams of immigration. So it's a very large number of people that have come in, and that is primarily because the government has given a lot of freedom to profit-seeking employers to go looking for lower wage labor, and also these post-secondary institutions, colleges more than universities. Colleges have clearly been the bigger culprit here. Many of them private colleges, so they've actually got a profit motive to bring international students in. Sometimes they never actually see the inside of a classroom because all of the education is online. It's a very shoddy college program, but what is key is that they are able to work in Canada. Now they are changing the rules so that they can work 25 hours a week instead of the 40 that they were allowed during the pandemic. But it's still a major draw for people to pay this, I would say, overpriced tuition for a private college so that they can get to Canada to work. So I think those manipulation of the temporary migrant channels by people in Canada. This is why we can't blame the people coming. The people coming are just desperate to try and make a living. It's the vested interests in Canada, the employers and the colleges, who are manipulating this system in ways that hurt both the migrant workers and Canadian workers.
I want to jump in actually just for a second, just to go back to Matt, because Matt, to get you to explain a term that not everybody will know. What is a couple of questions? What is sectoral bargaining? One, and then the budget. Were there items in the budget that were like throwing money at this like mythical labor shortage? So, 2 questions.
Yeah. So, sectoral bargaining is the ability for having a tripartite type agreement that includes government, that includes, the union sector and the employer, that bargains across the entire sector, rather than what we have now in a franchise model, which is store by store, shop by shop, company by company. And this happens in Europe, right? And what it does is it effectively raises the floor for everybody, and it also diminishes the ability for union busting that we see as such a profitable motivator for nefarious employers. And lastly, like, I think it's so critically important that labor is at the table when the economy is being planned. You can't talk about planning a labor market without having organized labor and workers present. Now, the most obvious application to this in ways in which the ability to unionize is becoming more and more at risk is the digital economy. Like, how the hell is Uber allowed to claim that it doesn't meet the ABC test for drivers? Like, you look at all the different ways in which it's becoming even more difficult for organized labor to step in. And again, in my mind, sectoral bargaining, I spoke about full employment. I love what my predecessor was talking about in terms of a jobs guarantee. But going back to the cooperative economy, to me, the best economy is a worker-owned economy, right? One in which workers actually own the value of the labor they create, rather than have it be shipped off to the dividends and the shareholders and the CEO bonuses of Bay Street.
And then the other question was the budget. Were there items in the budget that
So here's my deal with the budget, Robin. Look,
Yeah.
anytime that the Liberals say something that's beyond the next election, to me is empty and meaningless. So the only things that I've really focused myself on in the budget is making sure they meet the deadlines of our CASA agreement. And so, like, I am not interested in what the Liberals have to say about their so-called investments, because their investments, from my experience, just tend to be announcements that they end up re-announcing and re-announcing and re-announcing. So anything that in the budget, I would tell Canadians, people that are watching, that goes beyond 2025 does not exist, in fact. Doesn't. And in fact, I would go even further and say it's incumbent on us to go back to past budgets and make sure that the shit that they announced last year and the year before that is rolling out. Because I bet you there's a large amount of these investments and announcements that are still sitting kind of in the general coffers.
Okay. Actually, before we go on to the next question, did anybody else want to make any comments on the budget and whether they threw money at this imaginary
Well,
labor shortage?
gee, Robin would like to jump in, not about the budget, but to lift up something else that Matthew's talking about when we're talking about a economy. It's also incumbent that we need governments that are going to take away the barriers for unionization. So it's one thing to say sector-based bargaining. I come from the education sector. We are legislated in Ontario to do sector-based bargaining. It has its pros and its cons. We can go there on a different show. But the one thing that I would say is, problems that we have now is that even when we're trying to connect with these precarious workers, with the gig workers, is the fact that we do not have legislation in Ontario, for instance. There is no card check certification. So once you get the cards signed, you then have to do another fight. And then these companies are spending ridiculous amounts of money to quash unions. And so really, if we want to make it a worker economy, what we need is reform, where we're talking about card check certification, when we're talking about anti-scab legislation, which does not exist in Ontario, but kudos to my friends in the feds who have pushed that. If only we could get it across the country. But we need labor reform legislation. Workers can join a union without being threatened, so that the union can help them. We know that a good union job is the best thing for our economy, and that's precisely why we see the Liberals and the Conservatives fighting to ensure that the labor legislation that we need, both at a federal level and at a provincial level.
Okay. And
thank you,
Robin. Are you going to move on to the next question on?
Actually, no. Let me go on to the question about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, I just wanted to come back to Matt. You referenced it when you talked about driving the rage, the right wing, and how they, kind of whip people up into a frenzy and pit people against each other. So this question is actually to all of you as it relates to the labor shortage, and it's really sort of looking at the question of how does the rhetoric of right-wing populists like Trump in the US and Poilievre in Canada, how does that play out? And thinking about this in terms of the election that's coming up. I mean, we're beginning to see it already, right? Where it's this hard-hitting narrative that you've already all said tonight is completely mythical and incorrect, and yet it sticks. And so this sort of right-wing populism that divides people, that surely is going to be a dominant factor in the upcoming election. So I'd just like to get some of your thoughts and reflections on that, and what we can do to deconstruct that and to push back against it, and to try and sort of, talk truth to power in terms of what is going on with labor and workers and employment issues. It's going to get very twisted in the federal election. So maybe, Jim, we start with you, and then we'll give everybody a chance to talk on it.
If I had the answer to that question, Libby, I would be in politics instead of economics. And
I know you've got some views on it.
Reaffirm my lifetime commitment to stay out of politics after that question, because that is the elephant in the room. Absolutely. How do we respond to the rage that Poilievre and them are harvesting? That first of all ratifies the anger that people feel. They have absolutely every right to feel it, but constructs a narrative about why they are feeling that way and who the true culprits are. And on this labor shortage issue, particularly around the role of temporary foreign migrant workers in it, we're in a very, very delicate situation, and in a way a very dangerous situation, because the right wing, either explicitly or implicitly, is going to try and play a racist argument about how we have to stop immigration and blame the immigrants for what is actually a problem that's come from employers, supplemented by these shoddy private colleges. We have to absolutely prevent that, because that will be the kiss of death for working class unity in fighting this. So we have to have a story that acknowledges what actually is happening, and we can't pretend that what's been happening and the abuse of the temporary migrant channels isn't part of the problem that we're experiencing in our labor market. We can't pretend that, but we have to have a story that puts the blame in the right place, and that has solutions, including, as Laura and Véronique stressed, regularization for the people who are already here, and that puts the onus on who's actually to blame. So this is the vital question. We have to ratify the rage that working people feel in Canada, but in a way that builds something rather than tears it down.
Right. Thanks, Jim. And to you, Véronique, the same question. As we move into sort of an election scenario, how do we deconstruct this awful rhetoric that comes out and push back against it? And yeah, I mean, you're with the CCPA. You guys do fantastic work. I don't know how big a challenge it is for you to get the information out to people so that you can show people what's really going on. But any thoughts you have on this?
Yeah, I mean, this racist dog whistling, or it's kind of getting pretty explicit now, not so much dog whistling. It used to be immigrants are stealing our jobs, and now it's immigrants and international students are to blame for the housing crisis. All of a sudden, we've let too many in. This is why housing is expensive. Forget that we've made it, rent seeking, like market investment, profit seeking. So obviously, one of the things that my coworkers work really hard on is, dismantling the myths around what has caused the housing crisis and what can solve the housing crisis. So definitely recommend folks take a look at the research coming out of the CCPA BC on that, because obviously we're feeling that housing crisis particularly hard here, but so are migrants who come here to work and are underpaid and not a living wage, and then they themselves can't find suitable housing. So, they're kind of getting both ends of the stick there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Laura, just any thoughts on how this plays out in terms of the growing narrative of right-wing rhetoric?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing that we have to remember is to solve the problem that they created in the first place, right? This is a problem that was created by them, and can live in with rose-colored glasses that if only we vote for them, then they're going to fix it. But we just have to look at history and realize they are never going to that they created. It works for them. This works for them. And so the one thing I remind people all the time, federally, and I've lived it for the last 6 years provincially, really blame Ford for winning on a platform of working for workers when we as workers were not actually out there talking to each other. And in the lowest voter turnouts in the history of the province. And there is this belief of, oh, well, there's apathy. Apathy doesn't exist. Apathy is, something that we just use as an excuse. And it's why I'm so excited that our team has said, hey, no, and there's going to be difficult conversations. There's going to be times where people aren't going to agree. And that, right? It's okay to work through it together. Really at the heart of it, what is it that we're looking to do? I think we all agree, and we've heard it here tonight. We need good paying jobs. We need the ability to put roofs over our heads, security. We need to ensure our public services are kept public. And quite frankly, I think back in-house. But those are things that I think everyone agrees on. I don't think I can go out anywhere and say, hey, do you truly believe that you shouldn't be able to afford to pay your mortgage or your... I've yet to find somebody who says, oh, no, I think everyone should work 3, right? And I think it's getting out there and talking to people and saying, okay, well, then what does this actually look like, right? And who is driving this narrative that you think, oh, it's the people who created it? Well, they're not. So, and this is where we're working really closely with the NDP, where we're, to get workers in the party as well, so that we are electing good labor like Matthew, to say, hey, go, let's heard. And when you have that, that's when we're going to start to see wins. But I think you got to get out there and talk. You got to get off of, the 100, nothing is going to be solved on X. Nothing is going to be a Facebook post. You got to get out there and you got to have those difficult conversations, and you got to listen. You got to see what's actually driving people to believe that someone like Pierre is going to solve the country's ills. It won't. But then we also have to provide hope, and we have to be able to say that we can be part of the solution. I truly believe we're at a place where workers want to be part of the solution. So it's time to remind everybody there's way more workers, documented, undocumented, unionized, non-unionized, underemployed. There's way more workers than there are options. And it's time for us to actually band together and push back to see playing out. It's long overdue.
Thanks, Laura. And just before I turn it back to Robin to go to audience questions that are coming in, I just want to give Matt, you an opportunity to speak on this issue as well, in terms of how this leads into the next federal election, which I'm sure you're thinking of along with your colleagues, and how it is you get messages through to people, and how you you let people know what's going on and debunk some of these incredible right-wing narratives that are now dominating the airways, and people believe it. I mean, we see it all around us. It's very, very hard to fight against. So just very curious to know how you're thinking to go back up against that.
Yeah, it's something I think about all the time, although I don't think about it in the terms of a short cycle election period. I'm thinking that this is going to be a decade. This is going to be some work. And I want to dispel for people that are watching the myth of the charismatic leader. Yes, Pierre Poilievre is a carnival barking conservative who likes to cosplay as a working class person, a guy who picked up Ayn Rand in high school and hasn't put it down. That is true. But he's also not some genius. The truth is, liberalism is collapsing. Capitalism is collapsing across the West. I've been to Sweden and Denmark, all these places that were supposed to be progressive social democratic places that are falling into this trap, precisely because in this moment, people have been lied to under liberalism, which told them if you work hard enough, you'll get an education, you'll get a good job, you'll be able to take care of yourself and your families. That, in fact, is not true in this extractionary capitalist economy. So in the short term, we're seeing the rise of the far right, and it has to go beyond just the conversation of attacks of workers. They are attacking the institutions of democracy and government. That is what is happening before our eyes right now. We're watching it happen. They're reducing everything to a question of taxation, which again speaks to this kind of anarcho-conservative libertarianism that really wants to dismantle government. They don't just want to dismantle the social safety nets for workers, but for retirees. They're going after CPP. They want to go after all the things which they themselves have, dental care, pharmacare, benefits, pensions. They want people working to their graves in perpetuity. For them, the free market says, you're 85, I don't care, Miss Jenkins, you're still going to be at the Tim Hortons making minimum wage. That's their vision of the future of the country. What our responsibility is as New Democrats is to paint a more compelling picture for the future of the country. And I'll even say this on my own accord, I'm not speaking on behalf of the party, we got to get over personalizing the structural issues. Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre can take a walk in the snow tomorrow and never come back, and nothing would change. We need to start calling out the structures of this pernicious and violent economic system, call it for what it is, so that when the attacks on the workers, on their wages, rather than thinking about, oh, it's my taxes, right? They want to talk about our CPP as being payroll taxes, right? Like they want to go after every single thing that would protect the worker. EI, they want to go after all these things, and we have to be that voice that government is an institution for the common good. And I'll just say this, Libby, quickly. I've gone across the country. 2 weeks ago, I started off in Northwest BC, Prince Rupert, Terrace, Kitimat. I went to the LNG project to see for myself what $50 billion looks like. And what I heard was 20,000 workers that were being flown in and flown out in these man camps, very few local employment. And then when it's done, you're talking about like 300 workers. Wow. Well, Christ, for $50 billion, they could have provided a guaranteed basic livable income for all of those people in perpetuity and never had to look back, right? The point is that we are totally in a situation right now, which is absolutely about privatizing all the profits and socializing all the risks. And in the meantime, pitting people against each other. So we got to get out there and we got to have the whole conversation with people. I know I'm in the right place when I see Laura, and that's frequently, right? Because we're out there talking to people on picket lines and we're pointing out the very real fact. I would pay somebody $1,000 if they can give me a picture of Pierre Poilievre on a picket line somewhere. I would donate it to a charity of their choice. Show me that. Because at the end of the day, he doesn't give a shit about workers. That's just the truth. So that's the plain talk that we have coming out of Hamilton. Don't let people just assume and take for granted that we're going to be headed to a conservative supermajority. That absolutely does not have to be the case.
All right.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for that, Matthew. All right. So we are going to move on to some audience questions, although I have one quick question before that, because we've been talking about how the right-wing folks are using the racist narrative around temporary foreign workers. So we all have a sense, or I think on the audience, of how many temporary foreign workers are racialized. I'm curious, so do we have the data on that? How many are racialized? Specifically, how many are Black? Do we have that data? Is that data? Do we have that?
I didn't come unless it's an open book test, I didn't come with that number, my brother. But I could share with you, like anecdotally, when you're seeing sectors, I just share with you from my own experience and observation. It is absolutely the case that in our seasonal, and that's the other thing unemployment doesn't cover, is the seasonality of unemployment. It uses the average. So when you go into the agricultural sector, for instance, it's not really reflective of the true precarity of that work. But I know that whether it's Nova Scotia in the apple orchards or right here in Niagara with the tender fruit, it's a lot of folks coming out of the Caribbean. It is absolutely a lot of folks coming out of the Caribbean. What the numbers are, I couldn't tell you. It's just an anecdotal observation.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. I'll follow up on that and see if I can bring that to the next Off the Hill. But all right. So audience questions. So this is, again, for anybody who wants to jump in here. This is a good one as always. So it says a worker-owned economy sounds a bit like communism. Is it possible to achieve something like that in our essentially capitalist economy?
I would say that a worker-owned economy, like, I'm not talking about state capitalism. I'm not talking about the government controlling everything. I'm saying that it makes more sense for me that if workers in a cooperative economy were able to keep the wealth that they create, that's better than it going to this mythical fairyland called Bay Street, where they're playing with people's lives and their money and making them trade it in for their futures. So anybody who's in a small business scenario, anybody who's like small and medium-sized folks. I'll use this one reference for how I come to this conclusion. I think about Hamilton Specialty Bar that was bankrupted by Bain Capital, which was Mitt Romney's company. And at the time, I was a city councilor. And I know in the States, there are examples where workers have taken over factories, to show to the bankruptcy judge that they can keep it going as a going concern. So anytime we have this kind of mergers and acquisition, vulture capitalism come in to try to pick apart our industry and our economy, we should have first right of refusal for the workers to take it over and run that stuff. Sorry, my apologies.
Quite all right. Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
Well, I think the one thing that is like one of those other really great right-wing myths that the minute you start talking about a worker-led economy, that automatically we're moving to like the Iron Curtain communist gray skies world, right? Like it's, as Véronique said, dog whistle. But I would say like small business owners are workers. The world has not fallen apart because we have small business owners. And if, in fact, happening right now, with grocery stores, we were far better off when it was mom and pop, as opposed to these conglomerates that have entered into the chat. And like right now in Canada, there are 3 big players in grocery, right? And the mom and pop stores have been for the last 2 decades just completely squeezed out. So, we talk about how, and I just think, today we saw in Hamilton, a small becoming a member of SEIU. I mean, that's a worker led, right? That small business owner making a really, working really hard to have this bakery and deli in Hamilton, choosing to unionize their workers, SEIU, that support. That's how the economy grows, not by, pandering to Galen Weston. And so I think when I think about a worker led, economy, I think about those small business owners. I think about those small business owners that are sharing and doing extremely well to lift those examples up instead of going to this automatic, oh, it's communism, bring down the Iron Curtain.
And if I could just quickly, to make sure that people aren't misinterpreting, I have no qualms of calling for a democratic socialism. I have no qualms about saying that I'm ardently anti-capitalist, because capitalism by its very nature ends up in cartels and is based on the exploitation of workers. I believe in democratic economies in the same way I believe in democratic workplaces, which is why a worker-owned cooperative economy works better for me, and I think for the everyday person, than it would, say, Bay Street.
My coworkers at the CCPA, my coworker Alex Hemingway and Simon Peck, have just put together a big report on some of the policies that we could pursue to make worker cooperatives more likely, more tenable. But yeah, democratic ownership is the framing here, right? Like we want and support democracy everywhere, except for at work, where we have none. Outside of if you're in a unionized workforce and a good strong union, there's not really any democracy in the workplace. So have a look at those. There's some policies being put forward now that are a start, like employee ownership trusts. My colleagues there recommend a lot more. So have a look at that.
Thanks, Veronique. Just moving to another question that's come in from the audience, and this one's actually on AI. So maybe I'll put this to Jim, because I know you do a lot of sort of consideration and research on the future of work. So the question from one of our audience members is, how is AI contributing to labor shortages or to employment issues generally? Any thoughts on that?
Well, of course, there's been a lot of concern about technology in general and whether it's going to replace work and replace workers. We've seen that concern come in waves over the history of capitalism, really, from the early industrial era, when the Luddites were throwing wrenches into the machinery to try and stop it and save their jobs, to more recent fears about robots and automation, and now, of course, AI. At one kind of simple level, the concerns about AI are exactly opposite to the concerns about the labor shortage. I mean, if in fact technology was unfolding in a way that workers were being replaced in large numbers, then we definitely wouldn't have a labor shortage. We'd have mass technological unemployment. So in a way, it's in a different direction, but it comes from the same, I'd say, base concern that workers don't have much control and much security over their work lives, and so they're naturally worried about what's coming down the pike. In my judgment, we've done some work on this through our Center for Future Work. The risk of mass technological unemployment is not significant. We haven't seen that in history, and we haven't seen that in Canada recently. In fact, I would argue that Canada needs more robots and more automation and more capital, not less, as a way to lift in the quality and productivity and incomes of the jobs that we have. AI, of course, presents a whole unique set of challenges about who owns the data and how the data is used and misused, particularly how different forms of digital supervision and discipline and hiring and firing are applied in workplaces. So I think it's more a question of control and regulation of these technologies rather than a fear that they're going to lead to the mass replacement of work. Human labor is still the engine that drives the economy. Nothing happens without human labor, broadly defined, our mental labor and our physical labor. And that will always be the case. So I think the question is, how do we organize ourselves as workers to exert some control over how technology unfolds, rather than viewing technology per se as either the enemy or the savior? It's neither. It depends on how it's used and who's in charge.
And can you point to any jurisdiction based on the research and what you look at that is actually approaching that in the right way in terms of regulation and making sure that there's still equity in the workplace and so on? Is anyone kind of getting it and doing it right at this point?
Well, on AI, probably not yet. I think everyone's trying to figure out what it means and how we would regulate it, given the global reach of the giant digital companies, you know, Google and Microsoft and so on, that are leading it. In general, there are lots of good case studies about how workers collectively can influence and regulate and negotiate how technology happens. We put out a report even in our center of examples from Canada, from collective agreements that have got all kinds of very innovative provisions about trying to regulate tech change and advance notice and job security and job redeployment rights and training rights, et cetera, et cetera. So it's absolutely possible, if workers have collective power in a workplace, that we can make technology work for us instead of against us.
Thanks.
Libby, just real quick, I do want people to consider the way in which AI is used in two aspects of work that is emerging, which is the hiring practice. And a lot of times these algorithms have a baked-in bias because they're obviously coded by people who have conscious and unconscious bias. And so we can see that as being a potential threat to the way in which people are selected. And the other piece is this kind of really big explosion of surveillance within the workplace. So you think about the Amazon plants, facial recognition, all the different ways in which AI is being used to continually squeeze blood from the stone when it comes to the workers. Like, they are using these technologies to further put artificial productivity markers on people that literally have them peeing in bottles and, you know, not being able to go and do what they need to do to be able to survive. So AI does present a bit of a disruptor in the workplace, depending on how it's used. And as somebody who studies it in the ethics committee, I would say that we're decades behind where the technology is in terms of understanding it as legislators.
One thing I would add to that is companies also use AI to shirk their responsibility as employers. So, you know, we see this in the gig sector. It's not, you know, Uber is not in charge of anybody. It's the app, and the app is managing who does the work and when, and is the intermediary and not Uber. So all of these challenges that we're seeing across the country, across the world, to, you know, Uber's role as an employer, to these gig companies' roles as employers, is really challenging the, you know, AI and these myths that AI is passive and not, you know, a tool.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. That is all the time for questions we have today. So thank you all to our wonderful guests, Matthew, Jim, Laura, Véronique, for joining us today. Our live political panel, Off the Hill, will return next month. As a reminder, we now have a regular day set for the series. You can join us for Off the Hill every third Wednesday of the month, every month, which means our next Off the Hill will happen Wednesday, June 19th. So be sure to get an invitation for that event by signing up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/subscribe. And thank you, as always, to Rabble for hosting these great events. If you'd like to support Rabble, please consider becoming a monthly donor at rabble.ca/donate. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next month on Wednesday, June 19th. Thanks, everybody.